I came home early after the storm shut down the freight route. Rain hammered the roof while I stood outside my kitchen window and watched my wife pour whiskey for another man like he already lived there. Then my son lifted his glass and laughed. Mom deserved better than him years ago. My daughter answered quietly, "Just get him to sign tonight. After that, the house and accounts are ours." I gripped the spare key in my pocket because they didn't know I'd been preparing for this night for years. Before we begin, thank you for being here. It means everything. Drop a comment and tell me what city or country are you watching from. Today I'd love to know where this story is finding you. A quick note, this story contains fictional elements crafted for entertainment and reflection. Any resemblance to actual names or places is coincidental, but the lesson it carries is very much worth your time. The November fog hadn't lifted yet. It hung low over the yard like a gray wool blanket that nobody asked for, clinging to the dead grass and the old wooden fence that ran along the edge of our property. I was out there at 7 in the morning, the way I always was, on Saturday's worn flannel shirt work boots, a hammer in my hand and a mouthful of nails I hadn't gotten around to using yet. The fence post on the north corner had been leaning for 2 weeks. I'd been meaning to fix it. I liked fixing things myself. Always had. I drove the first nail in clean and straight, and the sound of it rang out sharp across the quiet street. Felt good. The kind of good that doesn't need an audience. That's when the kitchen window slid open. "Theodore!" Eleanor's voice cut through the cold air like she was swatting a fly. "Would you look at yourself, honestly?" I drove the second nail in. Didn't look up. I said, "Look at yourself." Her voice climbed half a step higher. "You're out there in that filthy old shirt banging on the fence like some kind of handyman. The Hargroves across the street have a landscaping crew. Do you know that? An actual crew, with uniforms." "Morning, Eleanor," I said. "Don't morning Eleanor me." I could hear her grip tighten on the window frame. "We have money in the account. We could hire someone. Instead, you're out here at the crack of dawn looking like you rent the place." I pressed my palm flat against the fence post, tested it, still a little loose. I lined up the third nail. "Are you even listening to me?" Every word I said. She made a sound in the back of her throat, that short-clipped exhale she'd perfected over 30 years of marriage. The kind that meant she'd already moved on to being disgusted before she finished being angry. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," she said, her voice dropping into that low, precise tone she used when she really wanted something to land. "You've never had any ambition. None. You wake up, you putter around the yard, you drink your coffee, you putter some more. Meanwhile, the rest of the world is out there actually living. Damien took me to the Langham last weekend. You remember the Langham No? Of course you don't. You've never taken me anywhere that had a valet." Damien. There it was. Third time this week, she'd worked his name into a sentence before 8 in the morning. I straightened up, slowly stretched my lower back, and looked at the fence post. Straight now. The way it was supposed to be. "You know what your problem is?" Eleanor continued. Her voice had that sharp brightness that meant she'd found her rhythm. "You're comfortable. You've always been comfortable. And comfortable men never become anything worth talking about." I picked up my coffee mug from the grass where I'd said it took a long sip. It had gone cold. I drank it anyway. "Have a good morning, Eleanor," I said. The window closed harder than it needed to. I stood there for a moment with the mug in both hands, the fog curling around the yard, the street still quiet. A cardinal landed on the fence post I'd just fixed, sat there for exactly 3 seconds, then was gone. I'd heard that particular speech in one form or another approximately 1,000 times in 12 years, and every single time I'd written it down. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the light had gone thin and gray, the kind of November light that makes the whole world look like it's running out of something. I settled into the chair at my desk, the small one in the back room, the room Eleanor called the junk room, because she'd never once opened the door long enough to see what was actually inside it. I reached into the bottom drawer past the old road atlas and the warranty papers for an appliance we'd replaced years ago, and I pulled out the notebook, brown leather edges worn soft from handling, the spine slightly cracked, the kind of notebook a man picks up at a hardware store, not a boutique. I opened it to the next blank page. 1 November 2nd, Saturday morning, 7:14 a.m. I wrote the date in the upper corner the way I always did, neat, precise, unhurried. Then below it, "You look like you rent the place." Reference to the Hargroves landscaping crew. Third mention of Damien Mercer this week. Tone contemptuous performative. Duration approximately 4 minutes. I set the pen down and looked at what I'd written. People who kept diaries wrote about their feelings, their longings, the beautiful things they noticed and didn't want to forget. I understood that impulse I did, but this notebook wasn't that. This notebook was a ledger. Dates and times and exact words the way a careful man records exactly what was said, so that nobody later could claim it wasn't. 4,000 pages, 12 years. Eleanor thought I spent my evenings in this room reading old fishing magazines. Brandon, my son, thought the room was full of junk. My daughter Vanessa had never asked. I closed the notebook, locked the drawer, and went to brew a fresh pot of coffee. They thought I was the old man who didn't notice things, who smiled and nodded and shuffled around the yard in his worn-out boots, blissfully unaware of the world moving on without him. That was fine by me. Let them think that. 12 years ago, when Eleanor's spending first outpaced what I had told her we had, I made a choice. Not out of cruelty. Out of a question I needed, answered honestly, did the people in my life love Theodore Whitaker? Or did they love what Theodore Whitaker was worth? I needed to know. I needed to see it clearly, without the money in the way. I had not expected the answer to take 12 years to become undeniable. But it had. And now I had it written in ink on every page of the notebook in the locked drawer. Dinner that Saturday was pot roast Eleanor had reheated from the night before. She hadn't cooked it herself. She'd picked it up from the deli on Maple and pretended otherwise. I didn't say anything about that. The financial news played low on the television in the corner, a ticker crawling along the bottom of the screen, with numbers nobody at the table was actually watching. Brandon was talking. He was always talking at dinner. It wasn't conversation exactly. It was more like a performance, the kind where the performer needs an audience, but doesn't particularly care if they're paying attention. The Meridian Group event is next Thursday. He said, cutting his meat with the focused energy of a man who wanted everyone to notice how busy he was. It's a serious crowd, venture capital, commercial real estate, a couple of tech guys who just closed a Series B, exactly the kind of room I need to be in right now. That sounds good, son, I said. You want some company? Brandon's fork stopped moving. He looked up at me across the table, at my flannel shirt, at my rough hands, at the reading glasses I'd pushed up onto my forehead, because I hadn't gotten around to taking them off. Something shifted behind his eyes, a quick calculation, and then he let out a short laugh that had no warmth in it at all. Dad. He said it the way you'd say the word to a child who'd just asked something that didn't quite make sense. Come on. I'm just asking. I know you're asking. He set his fork down and reached for his water glass. But it's a professional event. These are serious investors. It's just not really your scene, okay? No offense. My chest tightened the way it does when something small cuts deeper than it has any right to. 41 years old, and he still had the power to do that, land a casual cruelty with the precision of a man who'd been practicing his whole life without knowing it. Vanessa, my daughter, kept her eyes fixed on her phone. She didn't disagree with her brother. She didn't agree out loud either. She just scrolled, which was its own kind of answer. Eleanor reached for the breadbasket and said, without looking at me, Brandon's right. It's a different crowd. A different crowd. I picked up my fork and went back to eating. The Meridian Group, I said, mostly to myself. You've heard of them? Brandon asked, a little surprised, a little condescending, the tone of a man who couldn't decide which reaction would be more satisfying. A little, I said. He studied me for one more second, decided the conversation wasn't worth continuing, and turned back to telling Eleanor about his new business cards. I looked at him for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to see him clearly, not long enough for him to notice I was doing it. Then I went back to my pot roast. I knew the Meridian Group event. I knew the venue, the catering company, the 2 partners who'd organized it. I knew because Whitaker International had quietly underwritten 30% of the evening's operating cost through a third-party sponsorship arrangement. My name was nowhere on the program. That was the way I preferred it. The following Friday evening, Eleanor told me there was a cocktail reception at the university club. She said it was a business thing, people she'd been meaning to introduce herself to, and that I didn't have to come if I didn't want to. I went anyway. The university club on Monroe Street had ceilings that made people feel important, and lighting that made everyone look like they were worth more than they were. Jazz quartet in the corner, bartenders in white jackets, the kind of crowd that collected business cards the way other people collected grievances. I found a chair near the window with a good sightline to the room. Eleanor had already moved off toward a cluster of women near the bar, her posture 3 inches taller than it ever was. At home, her laugh louder and brighter, and entirely manufactured. I was halfway through my water when he walked in. Damian Mercer, 55 years old now, give or take. He'd always been the kind of man who filled a room on arrival, not because of what he said, but because of how deliberately he moved, like every step had been practiced in front of a mirror. Navy suit, pocket square, cufflinks that caught the light. Hair silver at the temples in a way that looked carefully maintained. The smile of a man who had decided a long time ago that charm was a skill and had put in the hours. Eleanor's face lit up the moment she saw him, genuinely lit up, the way it used to light up for me 20 years ago. Theodore. She appeared at my elbow with Damian right behind her, her hand light on his arm. This is Damian Mercer. He's in commercial real estate, absolutely brilliant. Damian, this is my husband. Damian extended his hand. His grip was firm, practiced the handshake of a man who'd read a book about handshakes. Great to meet you. He said, his eyes dropping for just a fraction of a second to my shirt, the blue flannel, the one with the frayed left cuff. A small smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. Eleanor's told me a lot about you. I took his hand and looked straight at him. 25 years had put some lines around his eyes and replaced the nervous energy with a studied confidence. But the eyes themselves, pale gray, quick, always calculating the distance between where he was and what he wanted, those hadn't changed at all. Damian, I said. My voice came out even and unhurried. Good to meet you too. He held my gaze for a beat, waiting for something more, a smile, a question, the social lubricant that people usually provided. I gave him none of it, just looked at him the way you look at something you've already figured out. His smile didn't falter. He was too good for that. Eleanor pulled him gently towards someone else across the room, already laughing at something he'd said, and I watched them go. 25 years. He'd learned to dress better, to hold a room, to make women like Eleanor feel like the most interesting person in any conversation. He'd learned all of it. But those eyes. Gray and quick and hungry, always scanning for the gap between what a thing was worth and what he could get for it. I'd seen those eyes before. Across a conference table 25 years ago, when I'd signed the termination papers myself. He didn't recognize me. I could tell by the way he'd already moved on, already working the room, already forgetting the unremarkable old man in the flannel shirt. That was fine. He would remember eventually. The bedroom was the loneliest room in the house. It had been that way for years, two people on opposite sides of a king-size bed, the nightstand lamps casting that particular shade of yellow that made everything look like it was already fading. Eleanor was propped up against her pillows with her reading glasses on, scrolling through something on her phone. I was on my back eyes on the ceiling, listening to the radiator knock the way it did every November when the heat first came on. "Did you see the Tribune this morning?" she said, not looking up. "Parts of it," I said. Damian was in the business section. She said his name the way some people say Paris, like the word itself was a destination. Top 50 most influential business figures in Chicago. They did a full profile, half a page. Good for him, I said. Eleanor set her phone face down on the nightstand and turned to look at me, and I could feel the weight of it even before she spoke. "Do you know what it feels like?" She said, her voice going quiet and precise, the way it did when she wanted every word to find its mark. "To go to a dinner party and have nothing to say about your own husband. People ask me, they always ask Eleanor, what does Theodore do these days? And what am I supposed to tell them?" Her jaw tightened. "That you fixed the fence last weekend." My chest ached with something dull and deep that I'd stopped trying to name years ago. "I've built things, Eleanor," I said. "You know that. I know what you tell me." She pulled the blanket up higher, like she was drawing a line. "I know what I used to believe. But I look at Damian, and I look at you, and I think I spent 30 years waiting for you to become something. And instead, I'm lying here watching the news ticker while you sleep." The radiator knocked again. Outside, a car passed on the street, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling. "You said you've been waiting," I said. My voice stayed flat and even the way I needed it to stay. "What exactly have you been waiting for, Eleanor?" She opened her mouth, then closed it. Something moved behind her eyes, not guilt, not quite, but something adjacent to it. The flash of a person who'd gone further than they planned and didn't want to say the next part out loud. She reached over and turned off her nightstand lamp. "Good night, Theodore," she said. I lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling a long time after her breathing evened out into sleep. The ache in my chest didn't leave. It never really left anymore. But underneath it, steady and quiet as a river in winter, was something else entirely. She hadn't answered the question, but she didn't need to. I already knew. Tuesday morning came in cold and gray, the kind of morning that made the whole neighborhood look like a photograph someone had developed wrong. I was on my second cup of coffee. The Tribune spread open on the kitchen table when I heard the familiar sound of Gloria Bennett's old Buick pulling into the driveway. Gloria had worked for our family for 11 years, before Eleanor had let her go. Politely, she'd said, a restructuring of household needs, which had meant Eleanor didn't want someone around who'd known us too long. Gloria was 74 years old, built like a woman who'd carried her own weight her entire life, with white hair. She kept pinned back and hands that were always either cooking something or fixing something. She still came by once a week with food she'd made herself, and Eleanor tolerated it the way you tolerate a habit you haven't found the right moment to break. I opened the back door before she could knock. "You look tired," she said, handing me a glass container of her chicken and vegetable soup. "Did you sleep?" "Some," I said. "Coming out of the cold." "Can't stay." She patted my arm the way she always did, firm, brief, matter of fact. "I've got Mrs. Patterson's groceries to drop off on Birchwood." She reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Here, don't open it until I'm gone." I took it. "Gloria." "Theodore." She looked at me steadily, the way she'd always looked at me, like she could see something that most people couldn't be bothered to look for. "You've always known things other people didn't. Trust that." She was back in her Buick and out of the driveway before I'd unfolded the paper. I set my coffee mug down and read it at the kitchen table. Tuesday, October 29th, 12:40 p.m. Booth in the back, Delacroce on West Huron. Eleanor Damien Mercer, Brandon Vanessa. Lunch 2 hours, left separately. Thursday, October 31st, 10:15 a.m. Office building, 233 South Wacker, 14th floor. Suite 1407. Eleanor and Damien, no kids. Stayed 45 minutes. Suite 1407 is registered to a firm called Aldridge and Crane. They don't do divorces. I read it twice. Then I set it down on the table and picked up my coffee. Aldridge and Crane. I knew the name. They specialized in estate planning and financial power of attorney arrangements, the kind of legal work that got done when someone wanted to quietly legally transfer control of another person's assets. In Illinois, a financial power of attorney document allows the named agent to manage bank accounts, real estate investments, and financial decisions on behalf of the grantor. If that grantor had been medically documented as cognitively impaired, a court could also appoint a legal guardian, giving that person near total control over both finances and personal decisions, including where the grantor lived. They didn't want a divorce. A divorce would mean splitting assets, legal fights. Theodore Whitaker walking away with half of everything. What they wanted was simpler and far more complete. Have me declared incompetent, hand, Damien or Eleanor, power of attorney. And I wouldn't just lose the house, I'd lose the ability to make a single financial decision without their signature. They wanted the whole board, not just a few pieces. I folded Gloria's note, tucked it into my shirt pocket, and finished my coffee. Damien had booked the private dining room at Sable on North State Street, the kind of room with no windows facing the main floor, a door that closed all the way, and a staff trained to disappear between courses. Eleanor sat to his right. Brandon was across from her jacket, on the look of a man who'd told himself this was a business meeting because that made it easier. Vanessa was beside her brother, turning her wine glass slowly by the stem. 3 weeks, Damien said. He had a way of speaking at dinner that made everything sound like a reasonable proposal, calm, unhurried, the voice of someone who considered himself the smartest person in the room and had decided not to make a production of it. That's a realistic timeline, assuming we move efficiently. 3 weeks to what exactly? Brandon asked. I want to understand the steps. Step 1. Damien said, cutting into his salmon, is medical documentation. I have a physician who can conduct a cognitive assessment and produce a report indicating mild to moderate cognitive decline. Nothing dramatic, just enough to support a petition for guardianship and trigger the power of attorney provisions. Vanessa's hand stilled on her wine glass. He's not actually... It doesn't matter what he actually is, Damien said pleasantly. It matters what the paperwork says. Eleanor reached for her water glass, her diamond bracelet catching the candlelight. She looked composed, practiced, like a woman who had already had this conversation with herself many times and arrived at peace with it. "And the house?" Brandon asked. "Once the financial power of attorney is in place, the house can be listed." Damien spread his hands. "Theodore would be relocated to an appropriate facility, comfortable, well-staffed. He'd be taken care of." "How much is the house worth?" Vanessa asked. "At current market, somewhere between $850 and $920. Damien picked up his wine. "But that's not the primary asset. The primary asset is the retirement account and whatever else he's been sitting on that Eleanor doesn't have full visibility into." Brandon leaned forward. "You think there's more?" "There are always more," Damien said, and smiled the way a man smiles when he's the only one at the table who knows the punchline. "The question is how much more and how quickly we can get proper access to determine that." Eleanor straightened slightly in her chair, and for just 1 second something flickered across her face. Not guilt, but a close cousin of it. Then it was gone. 3 weeks, she said. "All right. If everyone does their part," Damien said, raising his glass, "then yes, 3 weeks." The four of them touched glasses with a soft, clean clink that sounded in that quiet, private room, almost like a verdict. The adjacent table sat empty and dark, its chairs pushed neatly in. A small black device, no larger than a thumb drive, sat flush against the base of the table's center floral arrangement, its indicator light invisible in the dim candlelight. It had been there since before they arrived. Richard had arranged the room reservation through a contact at Sable, who had worked with us for years. Under Illinois law, a recording is permissible when one consenting party to the conversation is present or has authorized the device. We had ensured that condition was met before the evening began. Catherine had reviewed the method herself. Friday evenings had a rhythm in our house that hadn't changed in years. Eleanor would make herself a gin and tonic at 6:30. I'd settle into the armchair by the window with whatever I was reading, and somewhere around 7, she'd bring me a glass of scotch. The good kind. She always made sure to say the Glenfiddich, not the cheap stuff, and set it on the side table next to my elbow, like she was doing me a kindness. I used to think she was. She came in from the kitchen holding the glass carefully, both hands the way you'd carry something fragile. Her smile was the warm, practiced one she'd been using for company for 30 years. "Here you go," she said, setting it down. "Long week." "It was," I said. I didn't touch the glass. She settled onto the far end of the sofa with her own drink and picked up the remote. The evening news came on something about a downtown development project, a city council vote, the kind of story that would have interested me once. I waited until she was absorbed in the screen, then I reached over and lifted the glass, brought it close the way a man does when he's about to enjoy something. The color was right, that particular amber that Glenfiddich got at 15 years, but the smell was off. Not dramatically, not enough that most people would catch it. Just a faint sweetness underneath the peat, the kind of sweetness that had no business being there. I set the glass back down. "You mind if I switch to water tonight?" I said. "Stomach's been a little off." "Of course." Eleanor glanced over with a look of mild concern that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'll get you some." The moment she disappeared into the kitchen, I picked up the scotch, carried it to the potted fern by the window, the one she'd bought 2 years ago, and never watered herself, and poured it quietly into the soil. Back in my chair, I pulled a small flask from the inside pocket of my cardigan. My own scotch poured from my own bottle, kept in the locked cabinet in my study. I took a slow sip. Eleanor came back with a glass of water and set it beside me. "Better?" she asked. "Much," I said. She went back to the news. I went back to my book. The ferns stood quietly in the corner, doing whatever ferns do with things poured into them without their consent. That was the 18th time. The first time 3 weeks earlier, I'd caught it by accident, that same wrong sweetness, that faint chemical edge that Glenfiddich at any age had no right to carry. Gloria had warned me the week before that Eleanor had been spending time with a physician whose practice was not exactly prominent. I'd started paying attention after that, closer attention than Eleanor knew. What she was using, based on what Gloria had since found out, was a low-dose sedative, the kind that built up, slowly made a person foggy, slowed their responses, made them seem confused and forgetful in ways that were hard to pin on any single incident. The kind of thing that over time could make a 72-year-old man look like exactly what Damien Mercer needed him to look like. I turned a page of my book. My hands were perfectly steady. Brunch on Saturday was at Maple and Rye on West Randolph Brandon's choice because Brandon always chose restaurants where the mimosas were $14 and the menu had words like artisanal and house cured in front of everything. Eleanor was absent. Brandon had explained it with a small dismissive wave. Mom had a prior commitment, which was the kind of thing you said when the truth was less convenient. Charlotte Bennett sat across from me next to Brandon with the composed expression of a woman who had learned to be careful about how much she showed. She was 33, sharp-eyed, the kind of pretty that came from good bones rather than effort. She worked in financial consulting, Brandon had told me once, in a tone that suggested he considered her career an accessory to his own ambitions. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, when the food had arrived and Brandon had turned to check his phone. "Brandon mentioned you used to work in logistics. How did you get into that?" Brandon looked up from his phone with the expression of a man who had just heard a fuse light. "Dad was in a bunch of different things," he said with the smooth ease of someone redirecting traffic. "Nothing too specific. You know how it is with that generation, a little of this, a little of that." He smiled at Charlotte, then at me, the smile landing somewhere between patronizing and apologetic. "He's more of a handyman type now." "Right, Dad." The words landed like a flat stone on still water. Not a splash, just a small, ugly thud that sent ripples outward. Charlotte's eyes moved to me. I could see her recalibrating the quick intelligence behind her expression, doing the work that polite people do when they've just witnessed something unkind. I looked at her and smiled. Not a sad smile, not the smile of a man absorbing an insult. Just a quiet, unhurried smile, the kind that meant I knew exactly where every piece on the board was, and I was in no particular rush. Charlotte held my gaze for 2 beats longer than she needed to, and something shifted in her face. Curiosity. Real curiosity, the kind that didn't let go easily. "That must take a lot of skill," she said, looking back at me with her chin slightly lifted. "Knowing how things work well enough to fix them yourself." "It does," I said. "Most people would rather pay someone else to understand their problems for them." Brandon missed it entirely. He was already back on his phone. That evening in her apartment on the north side, Charlotte called Gloria. Gloria picked up on the second ring the way she always did. "Gloria," Charlotte said, her voice tighter than she intended. "I had brunch with Brandon's family today. His father was there." "I know," Gloria said. "Brandon talked about him like he wasn't even in the room. Like he was furniture." Charlotte's voice tightened with something that felt unexpectedly like anger on behalf of a man she barely knew. But Mr. Whitaker just smiled, like he found it funny, like he knew something none of us did. There was a pause on Gloria's end. "Gloria," Charlotte pressed, "Who is he? Who is Theodore Whitaker really?" Gloria took a breath. When she spoke, her voice was careful and deliberate, the way it got when she was choosing each word, like she was packing something fragile. "You should find out for yourself," she said. "But Charlotte, be careful about what you go looking for, because once you know, you can't unknow it. And when you do find out, you're going to have to decide very quickly what kind of person you want to be." Charlotte stood at her kitchen window, looking out at the city lights, her heart beating just a little faster than normal. "That's not an answer, she said. "No," Gloria agreed. "It isn't." Monday morning. The clinic on North Michigan had no name on the door, just a suite number, and a small brass plate that said Neurological Associates Private Practice. The kind of place that didn't advertise because it didn't need to. Dr. Raymond Holt had been conducting cognitive assessments for 40 years. He was methodical, unhurried, and entirely unimpressed by anyone, which was exactly why I'd chosen him. 2 hours of testing. Memory sequencing pattern recognition, executive function, processing speed, verbal fluency. The full battery. When it was over, Dr. Holt set his pen down, folded his hands on the desk, and looked at me with the expression of a man delivering a verdict. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, "you are cognitively speaking in the top 15% of men your age. There is nothing in these results, nothing that would support any claim of impairment decline or diminished capacity. Not even borderline." "Good," I said. "I need that in writing, sealed and certified. My office will have it ready by Wednesday." He studied me for a moment with professional curiosity. "May I ask what this is for?" "Insurance," I said. Catherine Lowell was waiting in the lobby when I came out, 63 years old, silver-haired, with the kind of posture that came from 20 years of standing in front of judges. She was the best trust and estates attorney in Illinois, and she was the only person outside of Richard Sloan who knew the full picture of what Theodore Whitaker actually owned. "Clean?" she asked, falling into step beside me. "Completely," I said. She pushed open the door, and we walked out into the cold November air. She pulled her coat tighter and kept her voice low. "We could move now, Theodore. We have the recording from Sable. We have Gloria's documentation. We have enough to—" "Not yet," I said. "They're going to bring in their physician within the week. Once that paperwork exists, even fraudulent paperwork creates a legal burden to—" "Catherine!" I stopped walking. She stopped too and looked at me. "I need them to go further. I need every piece on the board visible before I move." I held her gaze. "Can you give me 2 more weeks?" She exhaled slowly, the cold air turning her breath to vapor. 2 weeks, she said. "But there's something else you need to know?" She reached into her coat and produced a folded document, a letter single page from a law firm I didn't recognize. "Mercer's people approached me 6 days ago, through an intermediary. They offered $18 million for information about your trust structure and asset holdings." My jaw tightened. $18 million. The number was chosen precisely large enough to be life-changing for almost anyone calibrated by someone who'd done their research. "And," I said. Catherine met my eyes directly and said, "I declined." She said it firmly, unequivocally. But there was something in the set of her mouth afterward, a tension she was working to keep out of her expression, a small, involuntary tightening that she controlled within a second, but not before I'd seen it. I took the letter from her, folded it, and put it in my coat pocket. "Thank you, Catherine," I said. We walked to our separate cars in the cold. I didn't ask her how long she'd taken to decide. I didn't know whether the answer would have reassured me. What I did know was that Damian Mercer had no idea that Catherine had a son. 29 years old, currently in Northwestern Memorial, with a cardiac condition that had already cost her more than she'd told anyone. $18 million. I walked to my car, got in, and sat with the engine off for a long moment, the November cold pressing against the windows. I needed to make a phone call, but first I needed to decide exactly what I was going to do about Catherine Lowell and how much it was going to cost a man who had offered her everything he thought she needed. The attorney's office on LaSalle Street had the particular smell of places where decisions get made and nobody discusses them afterward. Old paper leather chairs, the faint chemical undertone of a printer that ran all day. Vanessa sat across from Gerald Foss, who had handled name change petitions for 22 years and had stopped asking why somewhere around year 4. "The process in Illinois is straightforward," Foss said, sliding a form across the desk. "You file a name change petition with the Circuit Court of Cook County. A hearing is scheduled typically 4 to 6 weeks out. Assuming there's no fraud, no outstanding criminal matters, no attempt to evade creditors, the petition is granted. You'd be legally Vanessa Mercer within 8 weeks. Vanessa picked up the pen. Her fingers were perfectly steady. "And my current legal name disappears from public record?" she asked. "Not disappears," Foss said carefully. "The change is filed with the court, but your new name becomes your legal identity going forward: driver's license, passport, professional certifications." She looked down at the form, at the line that read, "Current legal name, Vanessa Marie Whitaker." She thought about how that name had felt her entire life, like wearing someone else's coat. Whitaker? It sounded like hardware stores and work boots and a man who fixed fences on Saturday mornings when he could have hired someone. It sounded like everything she'd spent 36 years trying to outrun. She signed the petition without hesitating. "We'll file this today," Foss said. Walking to the elevator, Vanessa felt something she could only describe as lightness. The particular relief of a door closing behind you on something you were finally done with. She didn't feel guilty. That surprised her a little. But not much. 40 minutes later, in a corner office on the 42nd floor of a building on South Wacker, bearing no street-visible signage, Richard Sloan set a single sheet of paper on the desk in front of me. Richard was 62, lean, with the unhurried competence of a man who had spent 3 decades executing difficult things without drama. He'd been with Whitaker International since the real beginning, not the press release version, but the years when it was just the 2 of us and a borrowed office and a logistics contract that could have gone either way. He said nothing. He placed the paper down and stepped back. I read it, 1 paragraph. Vanessa Marie Whitaker, name, change petition. Circuit Court of Cook County. Filed 10:47 a.m. today. My chest didn't tighten. My hands didn't shake. What happened was quieter, and in some ways worse. The last remaining thread of doubt I hadn't admitted I was still holding on to went slack and fell away entirely. "Thank you, Richard," I said. He nodded once and left without another word. I sat with it for exactly 90 seconds. Then I opened the brown leather notebook and wrote the date, the time, and 4 words: no more room for doubt. Wednesday evening arrived with the kind of cold that got into the house regardless of the furnace. I was in the armchair reading when Brandon's car pulled into the driveway. He came in without knocking the way he had since he was 16, and decided knocking was for guests. "Hey, Dad," he set his coat on the sofa and dropped a manila folder on the coffee table. "Just some paperwork I wanted to go over." "What kind?" I asked, not reaching for it. "Financial management stuff. Mom and I were talking about simplifying the household accounts." His voice was casual, his expression arranged to match. "Nothing complicated." I opened the folder, 11 pages. The cover described it as a household financial management authorization, a clean title for what it actually was, a comprehensive financial power of attorney, granting Brandon and Eleanor joint authority over every account, property, and asset held in my name. Page 4 defined incapacitation so broadly that a single physician's statement would trigger it. Page 7 contained a real property disposition clause with no geographic or value limits. Page 9 allowed the authorized agents to amend or revoke existing trust arrangements. Catherine had reviewed this document last week. She had found 17 provisions that a court could classify as predatory or in violation of Illinois Power of Attorney Act standards. She had color-coded them in red. I had that copy in my study. I closed the folder, picked up my pen. Brandon's posture straightened almost imperceptibly, the instinctive lean of a man expecting to get what he came for. I held the pen for 3 full seconds. Then I set it down on the closed folder and looked at my son. "Let me read through it more carefully first," I said. "Dad, there's really nothing in there that needs Brandon, level, unhurried," the voice I used when a conversation was finished. I said, "I'll read it." He picked up his coat with the tightly controlled movements of someone hiding irritation. At the door, he turned back. "Don't take too long. Mom wants everything sorted before the holidays." "Good night, Brandon," I said. After his headlights swept out of the driveway, I sat with the folder on the table and thought about the boy he'd been at, 6 years old, asleep in the truck after baseball practice, his head against the window mouth slightly open. I'd carried him inside more times than I could count. My chest ached with something old and heavy that had by now no cure. Friday evening. Eleanor's key in the lock at 7:45, and a half-second later, a second set of footsteps behind hers. Damian Mercer walked into my house in a charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. He looked around the living room, the way a man examines a property he's already decided to buy. Then he crossed the room, settled himself into my armchair, my chair the one by the window. 19 years mine picked up the television remote from the side table and changed the channel from the news program I'd been watching to a cable business network. Eleanor smiled from across the room, the bright social smile of a woman who wanted everyone to pretend this was perfectly normal. "Theodore, you remember Damien," she said. "I do," I said. Damien glanced up. "Hope you don't mind. Wanted to catch the market close." The rage that moved through me was real clean and entirely justified. But I had learned over 72 years that men who showed their anger handed over everything. So I breathed through it, felt it settle, and by the time Eleanor turned to fix herself a drink, my face had not changed at all. "Not at all," I said pleasantly. I walked down the hall to my study, closed the door, and dialed Richard. He answered on the first ring. "Richard." My voice came out exactly as I needed, even precise, unhurried. "I want a full audit of every financial transaction connected to Damian Mercer. Every account entity partnership loan and contract that touches anything in our network. Every dollar, starting from the first day his name appears anywhere in our records." "Timeline," Richard said. "As fast as you can do it cleanly. Start with the loans. I want to know exactly how deep into our ecosystem he is before the week is out." "Understood. Preliminary picture by Monday morning." I set the phone down and looked at the closed study door. Through it muffled, I could hear the television Damien's channel playing in my house from my armchair. Let him enjoy it. He had at the absolute outside 11 days left. The conference room on the 42nd floor had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the whole of Chicago on a clear day. Monday morning, the lake was steel gray and the skyline was wrapped in low cloud, the kind of November weather that made the city look like it was keeping secrets. Richard had arranged everything before I arrived, the projector running 3 copies of the briefing document face down on the table coffee that was actually hot. Sitting across from me was a man I hadn't met before Friday when Richard had placed his file on my desk with a single sentence. He's been watching Mercer longer than we have. Michael Reeves was 49 with the particular build of a man who had spent years sitting very still in rooms while other people incriminated themselves. Former senior investigator at the SEC's Chicago regional office. He'd left the agency 4 years ago. Voluntarily, he said, though the word had a slight weight to it that suggested the full story was longer. He had a manila folder in front of him that was 2 inches thick. 3 cases, he said without preamble. He opened the folder and laid 3 photographs on the table, women all of them between 60 and 75, all of them photographed at what appeared to be social events smiling unaware. 15 years, different cities, different industries, same pattern. He tapped the first photograph. Sandra Hollis, retired pharmaceutical executive, widowed, net worth approximately $4.2 million at the time of contact. Mercer introduced himself at a charity event in Cincinnati, cultivated the relationship over 8 months, isolated her from her adult children by convincing her they were after her money. He paused. Which was, in the end, exactly what he was after. She signed over financial power of attorney 14 months after they met. Her accounts were drawn down by 60% over the following year. When her daughter finally got access to her finances, the money was gone and Mercer had moved on. Richard was watching me. I kept my face entirely still. Case 2. Michael moved to the second photograph. Patricia Wren, retired judge, widowed, St. Louis. Similar pattern, tighter timeline. He moved faster with her perhaps because he needed liquidity quickly at that point. She lost approximately $2.8 million. Her attorney filed a civil suit, but she declined to pursue criminal charges. He folded his hands. She told her attorney she was too ashamed. The words landed in the room like stones dropped in water. Too ashamed. I thought about Eleanor, about the way she looked at Damien across a dinner table, the way her posture changed when he walked into a room, the way she had stopped somewhere in the last 18 months looking at me at all. The third case, Michael said, is where it gets relevant to your situation specifically. He laid down the third photograph. Vivian Mercer, his wife. They married 11 years ago. She was 61, recently widowed, owned a commercial real estate portfolio in the Boston area worth somewhere north of $12 million. The marriage lasted 4 years. By the time the divorce was finalized, the portfolio had been reorganized into entities that Mercer controlled, and she walked away with the house and a settlement that her attorney described to me as, and I'm quoting here, an insult dressed up as generosity. And she'll testify, I said. She has been waiting 12 years for someone with enough standing to make it matter, Michael said. He looked at me steadily. She'll testify. I picked up my coffee cup. The city outside the windows was gray and enormous and entirely indifferent the way cities always were. Damien Mercer had done this 3 times. He had walked into the lives of 3 women who were alone and grieving and hungry for something that felt like attention, and he had taken everything methodically and without remorse, and he had moved on. Now he was in my living room, sitting in my chair watching my television, and he had no idea who I was. Tuesday evening settled over the house with the particular silence of a place where 2 people were living entirely separate lives under the same roof. Eleanor was out at dinner, she'd said, with friends I'd never met. The house was mine. I went to my study, closed the door, and sat at the desk for a long time without turning on the lamp. Just the gray light from the window, the distant sound of traffic, the familiar smell of old books, and the lemon oil I used on the wooden desk every few months. After a while, I opened the bottom drawer, moved the road atlas, moved the appliance warranties, and from the very back, I pulled out a plain white envelope that had been there for 37 years. The paper inside had yellowed slightly at the edges. The laboratory letterhead was from a genetic testing service that no longer existed under that name. The technology had been new, then expensive, not yet routine. I had paid for it out of my own account, told no one driven to the lab myself. The result was still perfectly legible. Probability of paternity 0.00%. The tested male is excluded as the biological father of the tested child. Brandon had been 4 years old. I'd held the paper in my hands in this same room at this same desk, and I had sat with it for a long time, long enough to understand that the question in front of me wasn't biological. It was simpler and harder than that. It was only, what kind of man do you want to be? I had folded the paper, put it in the envelope, put the envelope in the drawer, and never spoken of it to anyone. He was 4 years old. He used to fall asleep with his head on my shoulder on Sunday afternoons, his small hand fisted in my shirt. He called me dad the way children call their fathers dad, without thinking about it, without question the way you breathe. Like it was simply the name for the person who was there. I had chosen to be that person. Every day for 37 years I had chosen it. And now that child, that man of 41, in his expensive suits and his practiced condescension, had sat in my living room and pushed a stack of papers across my coffee table that would hand everything I'd built to a con artist and put me in a facility where I would die without ever having made another decision for myself. My throat tightened until it hurt. I had loved him like my own. I had bailed him out of trouble at 24 that would have put him in prison. I had quietly repaired the damage from every bad decision he'd made and never once asked him to thank me for it, because that wasn't why I'd done it. I put the envelope back in the drawer, closed it, sat in the dark for a long time, the old ache moving through my chest like weather. Wednesday afternoon, in the glass-walled office Brandon rented on the 14th floor of a building on North Michigan, the day was going the way most of his days went, a great deal of motion in service of very little forward progress. Charlotte had come by to drop off contract documents he had asked for, the ones relating to a development deal he was pursuing on the south side. She knocked, pushed the door open, and stepped halfway into the room before she registered that he was on the phone with his back to her, his voice low and clipped with the particular energy of a man who was trying to sound more certain than he felt. "One just needs to happen before the holidays," Brandon was saying. "Once the old man signs, the whole thing moves. I've already had conversations with 2 of the Bennett portfolio managers, and once Charlotte and I are married, accessing the Bennett family trust for expansion capital is straightforward. Her family's lawyers won't push back if the request comes from a son-in-law." Charlotte went very still in the doorway. The Bennett family trust. The fund her grandfather had built over 40 years. The fund her mother had reminded her at every Thanksgiving table since she was 12 years old was not a personal checking account. It was a responsibility, a legacy, something you protected. Brandon turned around and saw her standing there. Something moved quickly across his face, a flash of alarm, controlled almost instantly into a careful, neutral expression. "I'll call you back," he said into the phone and ended the call. He set the phone on the desk and looked at her. "Hey, how long have you been standing there?" "I just got here," Charlotte said. Her voice came out steady. She was proud of that. "Good." He smiled the warm, practiced smile she'd fallen for 2 years ago, back when she'd believed it was real. "You find the contracts?" "Right here." She crossed to the desk, set the folder down, and turned to go. "Charlotte, I have another meeting," she said. "I'll call you tonight." She walked to the elevator with her pulse hammering high in her throat and her jaw set hard so it wouldn't shake. Inside her coat pocket, her phone was warm in her hand. She had taken the screenshot before she'd even fully processed what she was doing, pure instinct. The reflex of a woman who worked in finance and understood at a cellular level that paper trails were the only things that told the truth. The elevator doors closed. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished metal, composed, controlled eyes, bright with something that was equal parts fury and grief. That night, she called Gloria. "Gloria," she said when Gloria picked up. "I need to see Mr. Whitaker as soon as possible. It's important." On the other end of the line, Gloria Bennett didn't sound surprised. "I know," she said. "He's been expecting your call." The coffee shop smelled of burnt espresso and old wood, the kind of place where nobody wore a tie, nobody checked who sat at the corner table, and the waitress refilled your cup without asking. I had chosen it for exactly those reasons. Charlotte arrived 3 minutes early. She wore a gray coat, no jewelry, hair pulled back simply. Her eyes swept the room the moment she stepped inside, sharp, careful eyes that did not match the nervous fingers gripping her bag strap. Gloria had raised her well. She sat across from me and placed her phone on the table screen up. Her hands were trembling just slightly, the kind of trembling people try hard to hide but can't quite manage. "Good morning," she said, her voice steadier than her hands. "Good morning, Charlotte." I lifted my coffee cup. "You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't." She exhaled sharply, pushed the phone closer. "I need you to read this, please." I looked at the screen without touching it. An email thread, Brandon's name at the top, Damien's private address below. The subject line read, "Final confirmation transfer authorization, Bennett account." I read each line without rushing, took a sip of coffee, then set the cup down and slid the phone back to her. "What do you want to do with this?" I asked. Charlotte's jaw tightened. Her eyes went glassy. Not quite tears, but close the kind of burning that comes before you decide whether to cry or fight. She chose to fight. "I want to help you," she said, her voice cracking at the last word. "But I'm scared. If Brandon finds out I came here," she pressed her lips together, "I don't know what he'll do." I leaned forward slightly. "You don't need to do anything right now. Keep living exactly as you have been. Go home tonight, make dinner, answer his calls, smile when he expects you to smile." I held her gaze steady, unhurried. "But when the moment comes, I'll need you to stand in front of people and tell the truth. Just the truth, nothing more." I paused. "Can you do that?" Charlotte stared at me. Her chin was quivering, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. Then something shifted her spine, straightened her shoulders, squared, and she wiped her eye quickly with the back of her hand. "Yes," she whispered, "I can do that." Across the room, at a small table near the window, Gloria Bennett lifted her coffee cup slowly. She did not look our way. She did not need to. The girl nodded once more, firmer this time, and I understood Charlotte was not simply Brandon's fiancée. She was the daughter Gloria had quietly placed beside me to watch over me when I could not watch myself. The hotel conference room on Friday morning had no windows. Vivian Mercer had requested it that way. She was 54 with silver-streaked hair cut short and brown eyes that had seen too much to waste time with pleasantries. She sat perfectly straight in her chair, both hands folded on top of a cardboard box, the kind pharmacies use for storage, unremarkable, devastating. Michael Reeves sat to my left, a legal notepad, open pen, uncapped. "Mrs. Mercer," I said, "thank you for coming." "I came for myself," she said briskly, her Boston accent clipping every consonant clean. "Let's be honest about that." She lifted the box lid and set it aside. Fake contracts from 12 years ago, 3 real estate partnerships that never existed, each one backed by my signature on documents I did not sign. She laid the first folder flat on the table. Emails proving he initiated contact with me deliberately. Not coincidence, not romance. Her voice did not waver, but her knuckles whitened. Strategy. She set down a second folder. Wire transfer records, 4 separate accounts, all in his name, all funded from my portfolio without my authorization. $2.4 million. She looked straight at me. "I spent 12 years trying to find someone strong enough to stand behind me. Someone Damien Mercer could not buy, could not threaten, could not outlast." My chest was tight, not with surprise, but with something closer to fury held on a very short chain. "You'll have that person," I said. Vivian's eyes glistened. For just a second, the hard exterior cracked. Her breath hitched, her hand pressed flat against the documents, as if she needed to feel they were real. "He did this to Sandra Hollis," she said, quieter now. "He did it to Patricia Wren. He did it to me." Her voice hardened again, resolute as iron. "This is the last time." Michael's pen moved steadily across the notepad. The predator had hunted 3 times. The 3rd time would finish him. Saturday morning, Catherine Lowell's office on South Wacker was empty, except for Catherine herself on the conference screen above the table, her face sharp and attentive, and Lucas Grayson, who sat across from the empty chair, as if he expected the chair itself to judge him. Lucas was 47. He had the look of a man who had not slept in 4 days, pale skin, dark rings under bloodshot eyes, a collar button undone because his neck kept tensing. He placed a brown accordion folder on the table with hands that shook visibly. "Dual ledger," he said, his voice rough. "Every project from 2019 to last quarter, the real numbers and the numbers he showed investors." He pulled out a second stack. 3 ghost contracts, Harborview, Pinnacle West, the Meridian Annex. None of those projects ever broke ground. $62 million collected from investors who believed they did. He set down a 3rd envelope, printed emails, internal chains, dates, and names highlighted in yellow. These prove he knew. Every transaction, every quarter, he signed off personally. Catherine's face on the screen was unreadable. "Mr. Grayson?" I said through the video call. "Why now?" Lucas laughed short, humorless, the laugh of a man who had run out of options. "Because your investigator came to my apartment last Tuesday at 9 in the morning and showed me exactly where I'd be sitting in 18 months if I didn't cooperate." He rubbed his jaw hard. "I'm not going to prison for Damian Mercer. I was never going to be anything more than the man he threw under the bus first." His voice cracked. "So I'm choosing myself." The folder sat on the table between us, thick, heavy, irrefutable. Catherine looked at the documents for a long moment. Then she looked directly into the camera. She said one word. "Enough." The rain had been falling since 6 o'clock, and by 9, it was the kind of rain that made the whole world feel smaller, heavier, closer. Like the sky itself was pressing down on the roof of the house I had lived in for 31 years. They were all standing around the dining table when I came downstairs. Eleanor, Brandon, Vanessa. And behind them, half in shadow, one hand resting on the back of my chair, Damian Mercer. He wore a charcoal suit, no tie, the collar open just enough to look deliberate. His eyes found mine the moment I entered the room, and the corners of his mouth curved not a smile exactly. Something quieter, something that had been rehearsed. The table was covered in papers. Eleanor stepped forward first. Her chin was lifted, her jaw set hard, but her hands, I noticed, were gripping the edge of a folder so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "Theodore." Her voice was clipped formal, the tone she used when she wanted to sound reasonable and had already decided she wasn't going to be. "We need to talk about this tonight." She laid the first document flat on the table. Petition for dissolution of marriage, Cook County Circuit Court. "This is the best thing for everyone involved." Brandon moved immediately after her, the way he always had, following his mother's timing, her rhythm, her signals. He placed his folder beside hers without looking me in the eye. Financial power of attorney. 17 clauses. Catherine had marked every single one. "Dad," he said, his voice tight, rehearsed. "Just sign it and we're done. It's straightforward." Straightforward. My son, 41 years old, a man who had never once asked me what I actually owned, was standing in my dining room telling me a document that would hand legal control of my finances to Damian Mercer was straightforward. Vanessa set her folder down last. Her hands were shaking not from nerves, I realized, but from something closer to rage, the kind that comes when a person has convinced herself she is the victim of the story she is actively creating. The folder was labeled Sunrise Gardens Senior Living Intake Assessment. She pressed her lips together hard and said, "It's a good facility, Dad. You'll have everything you need. Everything I need." I stood at the head of the table and looked at each document in turn. Divorce papers, power of attorney, nursing home intake forms, 3 stacks of paper neatly arranged as if the tidiness of the presentation could make the thing being proposed feel reasonable. Then I looked at Damian. He had not moved. He stood behind my children with his hands in his pockets, perfectly relaxed, perfectly content. The expression of a man watching a plan execute itself. 25 years ago, he had sat across from me in a different office in a different suit, and I had handed him a termination letter for embezzling $400,000 from Whitaker International's operating accounts. He had stared at me that day with the same gray eyes, the same controlled mouth, and said nothing as security escorted him out. Now he was standing in my home. Now he was standing behind my children. The pain that moved through my chest in that moment was not anger. It was older than anger, deeper, the kind of grief that lives below words. My throat tightened until I thought I might have to clear it, but I didn't. I stood completely still and let the full weight of what I was looking at settle into my bones. "Theodore," Eleanor said, her voice rising slightly. "This isn't personal. This is practical. Just sign it." Brandon cut in louder this time, leaning forward on the table with both palms flat. His jaw was clenched, a vein visible at his temple. "Sign it and we're done. There's no reason to drag this out." Vanessa's eyes were wet, her breath coming fast, but she pressed forward anyway. "We just want what's best for you. You can't keep living like this." I let them speak. I let every word land. I looked at my son's hands flat on the table, hands I had watched learn to grip a baseball, hands I had steadied when he learned to drive. I looked at my daughter's wet eyes, eyes that had once searched for mine in the dark when she had nightmares, and I was the only one who could make them stop. I looked at my wife, the woman who had stood beside me in a courthouse 34 years ago, and said I do. While I was already building the company, I would spend the next 3 decades hiding from her. And then I looked at Damian Mercer one final time. He was the man I had fired 25 years ago for stealing from my company, and tonight he was standing in my home, orchestrating the theft of everything else. This was not the end. I understood that with a clarity so complete it almost felt like peace. This was the moment the real game began. I walked upstairs without a word. The bedroom was exactly as I had left it that morning. Bed-made tight curtains drawn the photograph of the Whitaker International, groundbreaking on the wall beside the closet door. I had kept it there for 31 years. Nobody in this house had ever asked what it was. I opened the closet and reached behind the winter coats for the small travel bag I had placed there 4 days ago. "Dad!" Vanessa's voice came from the doorway, sharp and uncertain. "What are you doing? Dad, you can't just—" "Where are you going?" Brandon appeared behind her, his voice cracking slightly now, the rehearsed certainty starting to fracture at the edges. I checked the bag without answering. 3 items, a black tuxedo and a garment sleeve, a brown leather notebook, and a sealed envelope addressed to Catherine Lowell, with 4 words written on the front: "Open after the gala." I zipped the bag closed. Eleanor stood at the bottom of the stairs as I came down. Her face had changed the composed authority she had worn. All evening was slipping, replaced by something rawer. Her eyes were glassy, her breath uneven. "Theodore!" she said, and for the first time in years, her voice carried something that might have been genuine feeling. "Where are you going? You can't just walk out, it's raining." "Where are you going?" Vanessa called, from the top of the stairs, her voice breaking completely, now a sob catching in her throat. "You can't just, Dad, please." I reached the front door. I gripped the handle. I turned and looked at all of them, one final time, my wife, my son, my daughter, and the man standing in the middle of everything they had built against me. I nodded once, slowly, deliberately. Then I opened the door and walked out into the rain. The street was dark and cold, the rain coming in sharp diagonals under the amber streetlights. My shoes were wet within 4 steps. I did not hurry. Across the street, parked beneath the elm trees that had been there longer than the neighborhood itself, a black Rolls-Royce Ghost sat motionless. The engine was running. I could see the thin exhaust rising and dissolving in the rain. The rear door opened before I reached it. Richard Sloane stepped out with an umbrella, already extended, his silver hair gleaming under the streetlight. He was 62 years old and had been running Whitaker International for 11 of them, and he moved with the particular unhurried precision of a man who had never once been late for anything that mattered. He lowered his head slightly, not a bow, something more deliberate than that, and said, "Welcome back, Chairman." I stepped under the umbrella. "Richard, your suite at the Langham is prepared. Catherine has received the secondary evidence package." He held the door open. "The gala venue confirmed the main hall booking this afternoon." I got into the car. The door closed, and the rain became a sound instead of a feeling, steady, distant drumming softly against glass. The interior of the Rolls smelled of leather, and something faintly like cedar, and it was warm in the exact way that the house I had just left had never quite managed to be. Through the rain-streaked window, I could see the pale glow of light from my front door still open the silhouettes of my family, visible in the frame. Eleanor's hand was pressed to her mouth. Vanessa's shoulders were heaving. Brandon stood rigid, unmoving, staring. Damian was not at the door. Of course he wasn't. "Richard," I said, my eyes still on the house as we pulled away from the curb. 11 days. Richard settled into the front passenger seat and folded the umbrella with quiet, practiced efficiency. "That's more than enough, Chairman," he said. The Rolls moved smoothly through the rain, and the amber light of the house grew smaller and smaller in the rear window until it disappeared entirely. Before I tell you what Theodore had quietly prepared for the night, his family finally made their move. Drop a flannel in the comments right now, so I know you're still with me. Every single comment means more than you know. And a quick note before we go, further parts of what follows are fictional elements woven into this story for the purpose of reflection and meaningful storytelling. If that's not your kind of content, no hard feelings at all, you're welcome to step away whenever you choose. The elevator opened directly into the chairman's office on the 43rd floor, and the first thing I saw was Chicago. All of it. The entire skyline spread across the floor-to-ceiling glass, like something painted Lake Michigan, a flat steel gray in the morning light. The grid of streets below still wet from last night's rain, the towers of the loop standing in their familiar formations. I had looked at this view thousands of times over 30 years. I had missed it the way you miss a language you grew up speaking. The staff were lined in the corridor when I stepped out. 22 people. Every one of them lowered their head as I passed. Nobody said a word. They did not need to. I walked to the desk, dark walnut cleared and polished, and sat down in the chairman's chair for the first time in 11 weeks. The leather settled around me like it had been waiting. I placed both hands flat on the desk and breathed once slowly all the way down. Richard Sloane stood across from me, a presentation binder, open in his hands, his reading glasses low on his nose. Behind him, 3 members of the legal team stood in a precise row. Jackets pressed files, ready expressions that said they understood exactly what this morning meant. Total consolidated assets as of this morning's valuation. Richard began, his voice carrying the particular measured weight of a man delivering numbers he had verified 3 times. $34 billion, logistics infrastructure across 14 states, 3 deep water port licenses, 12 regional distribution centers, 2,600 full-time employees. He turned a page. Active contracts with 41 Fortune 500 clients, federal freight corridor licenses renewable through 2031. I looked at him over the desk. Ann Mercer. Richard removed his glasses. Damian Mercer's total exposure inside the Whitaker supply chain ecosystem, direct contracts, subsidiary dependencies, third-party freight arrangements, $86 million. He closed the binder. Every dollar of it flows through infrastructure we control. I picked up the pen from the desk. It was a simple pen, the same brand I had used since 1987, the same weight, the same grip. I looked out at Chicago one more time. Then I looked back at Richard and the 3 attorneys standing at attention behind him. "Begin," I said. Richard nodded once and reached for his phone. Damian Mercer had spent the last 3 weeks believing he was stealing from a stubborn old man in a flannel shirt who drove a pickup truck and argued with his son over dinner tables. He did not know he was stealing from the man who owned 3 ports, 12 logistics centers, and 2,600 people who called that man chairman. He was about to find out. The call started at 11:47 in the morning. I was not in Damian's office when it happened. I did not need to be. Michael Reeves had placed a contact inside the building 2 weeks earlier, and the account reached me in summary form by early afternoon. But I have reconstructed it well enough from what followed. The first call came from First Meridian Capital. Damian's assistant, a young woman named Priscilla, efficient and unhappily loyal, knocked on his door and said in the careful voice of someone delivering news they are afraid of, "Mr. Mercer, First Meridian is on line 2. They say it's urgent." Damian took the call, standing up the way he always did when he expected good news. "What is it?" "Mr. Mercer." The voice on the other end was formal, clipped. "We're calling to inform you that your existing credit facility, the $86 million line, has been placed under immediate administrative review effective this morning. All drawdowns are suspended pending resolution." Damian's jaw tightened. "What kind of review? On whose authority?" "We received instruction from a third party with a material interest in the underlying collateral." "Which third party?" A pause. "We're not authorized to disclose that at this time." He ended the call and immediately dialed his primary investor in the Lakefront Tower project. It rang 7 times and went to voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. He called the man's personal cell, a number exchanged over dinner 2 years ago, never used except in emergencies. On the 4th ring, the investor picked up and said flatly and without preamble, "Damian, I can't talk right now. My attorney has advised me to pause all activity on the tower project until further notice." Pause. "That project is 6 weeks from." "I know what it is. I said I can't talk." The line went dead. Damian's hands were not quite steady as he set the phone down. He pressed his knuckles against the desk, his face tight, a muscle jumping in his jaw. He called his assistant back in. "Get me the freight coordinator at Continental Logistics," he said. Priscilla reappeared 90 seconds later, her expression carefully neutral, in the way assistants learn to be neutral when the news is bad. "Sir, Continental Logistics sent a formal notification at 10:53 this morning. 3 transportation contracts, Lakeview Heights, the Meridian Annex, and the Northbrook Residential, have been terminated effective immediately, citing a Clause 14B material dependency conflict." Damian stared at her. "Clause 14B. Yes, sir." Who filed the conflict notice? Priscilla pressed her lips together. The notice references a parent entity. It says, she glanced at the paper in her hand, Whitaker International Group. The color left Damian Mercer's face in a single visible moment. His chest heaved once fast, involuntary, and his hand gripped the edge of the desk hard enough to whiten every knuckle. His eyes moved to the window, to the skyline, to nothing in particular, the stare of a man whose mind is running calculations it does not want to finish. He did not know yet what the name meant, not fully, not the scope of it. But the cold spreading through his chest told him that he was already behind. By Thursday afternoon, Eleanor had chosen the dress. It was a wine-red satin gown, floor-length with a draped neckline, and a train that caught the boutique's track lighting in long, liquid ripples. She stood on the fitting platform with her chin up and her shoulders back, turning slowly, studying herself in the 3-panel mirror with the expression of a woman who had decided that her life was finally beginning. "This one," she said, firm, delighted. "This is the one." Damian sat on the cream sofa behind her, one arm stretched along the back, his phone face down on the cushion beside him. He had not looked at his phone once in the last 20 minutes. He was performing relaxation with the focused effort of a man who was terrified of what the screen might show him. "Perfect choice," he said, and his smile reached his eyes at exactly the right moment. "You look extraordinary." Eleanor laughed a bright please sound and stepped down from the platform toward the attendant. "We'll take it." The attendant carried the gown to the register. Damian rose from the sofa and followed, sliding his card across the counter, with the easy gesture of a man for whom money had never been a complicated subject. The attendant ran the card, waited, looked at the terminal, ran it again. "I'm sorry, Mr. Mercer." Her voice was professionally smooth, giving nothing away. "This card isn't going through. Would you like to try another?" Damian's smile did not move. "Of course," he said, his voice perfectly steady. "Try this one." He produced a second card, matte black, the kind that came with a 6-figure annual limit, and placed it on the counter. The attendant ran it, waited. Eleanor was examining a silk scarf on a nearby display table, her back to the register, humming something softly to herself. "I'm so sorry," the attendant said, quieter this time. "This one isn't going through either." Something moved across Damian's face, fast controlled, gone in under a second. His jaw tightened. His fingers pressed flat on the counter for just a moment before he pulled out his wallet and produced 4 crisp bills. "Bank system," he said with a short, easy laugh. "Always happens at the worst time. You know how it is." "Of course." The attendant folded the gown into tissue paper without looking up. Eleanor drifted back to the register, the scarf in her hand glowing. "Ready?" "Ready," Damian said. She did not notice his hands as they walked out. She did not notice the way he checked his phone the moment they stepped onto the sidewalk, the sharp intake of breath, the single second where his composure cracked before he locked it back down. She was dreaming about the gala. I was dreaming about the gala, too. But the two of us were dreaming about very different things. Richard set the document on the desk without a word and stepped back. It was a single printed page, a bank statement 11 years old, the paper slightly yellowed at the edges from being folded and stored. The account number was mine. The balance on the statement was $40 million. And in the lower right corner, in ink that had faded to a soft blue-gray, was Eleanor's signature. I stared at it for a long time. "Where did you find this?" I asked. Richard clasped his hands in front of him. "Our financial investigators pulled it from a document request related to the trust audit. It appears Mrs. Whitaker signed as a witness on a notarized asset disclosure 11 years ago. The account was part of a subsidiary holding structure." He paused. "She knew the account existed. She knew the balance." I picked up the document and held it in both hands. My chest ached, not the sharp, sudden kind of pain, but the slow, deep kind that settles in behind the sternum and does not move. The kind that comes when something you have carried for a long time finally has a name. "She didn't betray me because she thought I was poor," I said. My voice came out quieter than I intended. "She betrayed me because she thought I was hiding it from her deliberately. She thought I chose to keep her out." Richard's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a careful human understanding that he was too professional to voice. "Shall I add this to the evidence file?" he asked. I set the document down on the desk. I pressed my fingertip once against Eleanor's signature lightly, the way you touch something that used to mean something, and then I pulled my hand back. Yes, I said. Add it. Richard gathered the page with both hands and slid it into the folder. Will there be anything else tonight, Chairman? I looked out at Chicago, the lights of the city blazing against the dark November sky, steady and indifferent and beautiful. My throat was tight. My eyes stung in a way I had not allowed myself in a very long time. No, I said. That will be all. I understood Eleanor more clearly in that moment than I had in 34 years of marriage, and I could not forgive her any more than I could undo the 11 years she had known and chosen Damian Mercer instead of a conversation. Understanding and forgiveness, I had learned, were not the same country. They did not even share a border. Catherine Lowell's office at 10 in the evening looked like a place where difficult things came to be resolved. The desk lamp threw a warm circle of light across stacked files and yellow legal pads, and outside the window, the city was dark and quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes after midnight when the streets have finally given up. She was standing when I arrived, not pacing, but standing at the window with her arms crossed and her jaw set the posture of a woman who had made a decision and was still living inside the weight of it. She turned when I entered and immediately crossed to the desk. Sit down, Theodore. Her voice was steady but rough at the edges, the way voices get when someone has not slept properly in 3 days. She picked up an envelope from the desk and held it out to me. Then, before I could reach for it, she pulled it back and set it down flat on the surface between us. I want you to see it first, she said, before I tell you what I did with it. I looked at the envelope. Standard banking envelope, no return address. The name of a shell company in the upper left corner that I recognized from Lucas Grayson's ledgers. The payee line on the bank check inside, visible through the open flap, was blank. $18 million, Catherine said. Her voice cracked on the last word just slightly, just enough. Delivered to my home address, not this office, my home, which means they had been watching. She pressed both palms flat on the desk and leaned forward, her eyes bright with something that was equal parts fury and exhaustion. My son needs $2.3 million for a spinal procedure. The surgery center won't hold the slot past next month. Her chin trembled once hard, and she pressed her lips together to stop it. I held that envelope for 3 days, Theodore. 3 days. I sat at my kitchen table every morning, and I looked at it, and I thought about my son not being able to walk. Her eyes filled. She did not look away. What did you do with it? I asked. Catherine straightened. She pulled her shoulders back, lifted her chin, and looked directly at me with red-rimmed eyes that had clearly shed real tears and were done apologizing for it. I burned it yesterday morning, she said. In my backyard, in a metal trash can. I watched every corner turn black. The tightness in my chest broke open into something warmer and more painful than anger had ever been. I stood up slowly, both hands braced on the desk between us. Catherine, I said, your son's surgery, I will handle it. The full amount, by Monday morning. I held her gaze. You will not carry that alone. Catherine's composure, the careful professional armor she had worn for 30 years of trust law, cracked completely. Her hand flew to her mouth. Her shoulders shook once, twice, and then the tears came fast and silent down her face, and she pressed her fingers hard against her lips, trying to hold back the sound. You don't have to, she started. I know I don't have to, I said. That's the point. She nodded the small, broken nod of a person who has been strong for too long and has finally been given permission to put it down for a moment. The lamp threw its warm light across both of us, and outside the city was still and dark, and the gala was 4 days away. Not all loyalty came from strength. Some of it, the truest kind, came from being seen at your most breakable and finding someone who did not look away. The Crystal Ballroom of the Grand Hyatt Chicago held 1,200 people comfortably, and tonight it was full. Every chandelier was lit. The ceiling threw warm gold light across tables dressed in white linen and black centerpieces across the shoulders of women in gowns and men in tuxedos across the faces of people who had spent their careers building the kind of wealth that earned them an invitation to a room like this. The Chicago Symphony String Quartet played something smooth and European near the entrance. Waitstaff moved through the crowd with champagne flutes and quiet efficiency. Eleanor walked in first. The wine-red satin gown caught the light from 3 directions, and she knew it. Her chin was lifted, her shoulders rolled back, her smile the wide, satisfied smile of a woman who believed the evening belonged to her entirely. Damien entered beside her, one hand lightly at the small of her back, his charcoal tuxedo, immaculate, his silver temples gleaming. Brandon followed in a suit that cost more than he had told Charlotte. It cost shaking hands before he had fully cleared the entrance. Vanessa came last, phone already raised, already framing her shot. Stunning room? Eleanor breathed, her eyes moving across the ballroom with undisguised pleasure. Damien, you said it would be impressive. I said it would be the best room in Chicago. Damien smiled, scanning the crowd with the practiced ease of a man who had attended 100 events like this and always found his footing. I was not wrong. Preston Hale appeared from the receiving line, 63, silver-haired, the kind of broad-shouldered Midwestern authority that came from 40 years of running rooms exactly like this one. He extended his hand to Damien with a wide smile, his eyes warm and welcoming on the surface. Damien, wonderful to see you. And this must be Eleanor. He took her hand, pressed it briefly. Stunning. Eleanor laughed, delighted. Preston, you're too kind. Preston's eyes moved just once, just for a fraction of a second, toward the stage at the far end of the ballroom. Then they came back perfectly composed. Please enjoy the evening. We have a remarkable program tonight. Our primary sponsor this year has arranged something quite special. Damien nodded with the confident half-interest of a man who expected all programs to be unremarkable. Looking forward to it. Preston smiled once more and moved on. Vanessa was already posting. The caption read, "Tonight starts now." The photograph showed the ballroom behind her, the chandeliers, the crowd, the gleaming room, and in the background, almost too small to read, the main sponsor banner hung above the stage. We Taker International Group presenting sponsor. Damien's eyes caught it as he accepted a glass of champagne from a passing tray. He read it once. His brow pulled together just slightly, just enough to crease the skin between his eyebrows. Whitaker International, he said half to himself. Who is that? Eleanor turned. The sponsor. He nodded toward the banner. Whitaker International Group. I don't recognize the name. Eleanor glanced at it briefly and looked away. Old money, probably. Does it matter? Damien looked at the banner a moment longer, his champagne glass held still at chest height. Something moved behind his eyes, not quite unease, not quite recognition. Something that had not yet found its shape. No, he said. I suppose it doesn't. The hallway behind the stage was narrow and cool away from the noise of 1,200 people and the string quartet and the sound of a room full of people congratulating themselves on their success. I was standing at the far end, adjusting my cufflinks in the small mirror mounted beside the fire exit door, when I heard footsteps, quick, purposeful, slightly uneven, in the way that men's footsteps get when they are managing urgency while trying not to show it. Preston Hale appeared around the corner and stopped when he saw me. He was breathing harder than the short walk warranted. Mr. Whitaker. He crossed the distance between us in 4 strides and stopped 2 feet away. Then, with the deliberateness of a man who did not do this often, he lowered his head, a genuine bow, not the social kind. I want to apologize. When I received the guest list from Mercer's office, I had no knowledge of, I did not know that was your family. If I had known, Preston. I kept my voice level and met his eyes. I know you didn't know. That is not your fault. He straightened, exhaling. His face was flushed embarrassment, relief, and something closer to shame running beneath both. I would never have... I know, I said again. I picked up my jacket from the chair beside the mirror and pulled it on. The black tuxedo fit exactly as it had when I had it made 7 years ago. I smoothed the lapel once. Then I looked at Preston carefully. You still owe me something from 2018, the Lakefront Corridor vote. Preston's flush deepened. His jaw tightened, not in denial, but in the way a man's jaw tightens when a debt he has tried to stop thinking about is placed back on the table in front of him. Yes, he said quietly. I do. Tonight, I said. When the MC makes the introduction, you stand up first. Preston held my gaze. His chest rose and fell once, slowly. Then something in his expression resolved the embarrassment, burned away, and what remained was something cleaner, more direct. Stand up first, he repeated as if fixing it somewhere permanent. Yes, Chairman. I nodded once and turned toward the stage door. By 8:30, Damien Mercer's phone had vibrated 11 times in 40 minutes. He had ignored the first 6. The seventh was from a number he recognized: Lucas Grayson, his CFO, and he stepped away from the table with a murmured excuse. Eleanor reaching for her champagne, Brandon mid-sentence with a fund manager to his left. He checked the message standing near the edge of the dance floor, his back to the room. The text read, "I've turned everything over to Whitaker's attorneys. The full ledger, the ghost contracts the wire transfers. I'm sorry, Damien. I had no choice." Damien's hand tightened on the phone until his knuckles ached. His face went rigid jaw, locked eyes flat, the color draining from his cheeks in a single visible wave. He dialed Lucas immediately. It rang once and cut to voicemail. He dialed again. Voicemail, he tried the office line. A recorded message informed him that the number was no longer in service. His chest was hammering. He called his private banker next, the one who answered at any hour, who had handled his accounts for 9 years without question. Mr. Mercer. The voice that answered was not his banker's. It was formal, clipped the tone of someone reading from a prepared statement. Your accounts have been placed under an administrative freeze pursuant to a Securities and Exchange Commission investigative order effective as of 6 o'clock this evening. All transactions are suspended pending review. That is, Damien's voice cracked. He pressed his free hand flat against the wall beside him, steadying himself. That is impossible. On whose authority? The order was filed by the SEC's Chicago Regional Office in coordination with the Department of Justice. I'm not able to provide further detail at this time. He ended the call and spun back toward the table. His legs were unsteady, not visibly. Not enough for anyone watching to notice, but he felt it the way the floor seemed marginally less solid than it had been an hour ago. Eleanor looked up at him, bright-eyed, a smile ready. "Everything all right?" she asked. Damien opened his mouth, closed it. His eyes swept the ballroom, the crowd, the tables, the stage, and stopped. The banner above the stage was lit from below by the event spotlights, each letter crisp and large and unmistakable. Whitaker International Group, presenting sponsor, Whitaker. The name moved through his mind the way cold water moves fast total, leaving nothing warm behind. Whitaker? Whitaker International. He had heard that name this morning from the freight coordinator. He had seen it on the credit freeze notification. He had dismissed it both times because it had not connected to anything he recognized. It connected now. His mind lurched backward. 25 years, a different office, a different city, a termination letter placed across a desk by a man in a plain charcoal suit who had looked at him with gray eyes that felt nothing. A man who had said, without raising his voice, "You're done here, Mercer." Security at his elbow, his keycard already deactivated. The man with the flannel shirt, the old pickup truck, the retiree in the suburban house who grew his own tomatoes and fixed his own fence, and whom Damien had stood behind while his children shoved divorce papers across a dining room table. Not a retired nobody. Not a stubborn old man with nothing. The founder, the chairman, the man who owned the ports and the freight lines, and the 2,600-person national infrastructure that had just in the span of a single business day dismantled everything Damien Mercer had spent 25 years rebuilding. Damien's champagne glass slipped in his fingers. He caught it barely and set it on the nearest table without looking at it. His breath was coming fast and shallow, and he could not seem to slow it. "Oh, Whitaker, he fired me. I was in his house. I was standing behind his children, and I was in his chair, and The string quartet finished their piece. The room filled with soft applause. And from the stage, the MC's voice rose warm and clear above the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to introduce tonight's presenting sponsor and our guest of honor, Ladies and gentlemen, the founder and chairman of Whitaker International Group, Mr. Theodore Whitaker." The music rose, warmful, the kind of entrance music that had weight to it, and I walked out from the wings into the light. The spotlight found me before I reached center stage, and for 1/2 second the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Then Preston Hale rose from his seat at the front table. He did not hesitate. He stood up straight, both hands coming together, and began to applaud. The room followed. 1,200 people, all of them on their feet within the span of 4 seconds, the applause building from the front and rolling backward through the ballroom like a wave that had been gathering for a long time. I walked to the microphone and looked out at the room. I gave myself 3 seconds, not to compose myself. I had been composed for 11 weeks. 3 seconds to find the table near the center of the floor, 3rd row from the stage, where 4 people sat in varying states of collapse. Eleanor's face had gone the color of chalk. Her hand was pressed flat against her sternum, her champagne flute forgotten on the table in front of her, her eyes wide and fixed on me with an expression I had never seen on her face in 34 years. Something between recognition and ruin. Brandon had not stood with the room. He sat rigid in his chair, both hands gripping the table edge, his jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscle jumping from the stage. Vanessa's champagne flute was on the floor. She had not moved to pick it up, had not moved at all, her face stripped of every performance she had walked in, wearing her breath coming in shallow, visible bursts. And Damien Mercer sat perfectly still, which was the most telling thing about him. A man who had spent 25 years rebuilding from humiliation, who had walked into this room 2 hours ago with his hand at the small of my wife's back and his name on the guest list. That man was now sitting in a ballroom chair with no color in his face and no exit available to him, looking at the person he had believed was nothing. 3 seconds. I held their table with my eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then I smiled genuinely warmly and turned that smile to the 1,200 people who had just risen to their feet for me. "Thank you," I said into the microphone. "Please sit down. We have work to do tonight." The laughter was warm. The room settled. And for the first time in 12 years, I was not the man in the corner of someone else's room. I was the man standing in the center of the light, and every door in this building, every investor, every CEO, every contact worth having in this city, had been opened at some point by a key that lived in my pocket. I did not speak about myself. I did not speak about the rain or the papers on the dining room table or the 11 weeks I had spent watching my family dismantle everything they believed I was. I had not come to the stage of the Crystal Ballroom to describe my pain to 1,200 strangers. "I want to share something tonight," I said, "about a category of crime that is growing quietly in this country, the financial manipulation of older adults. It happens in boardrooms, and it happens in living rooms, and it almost always relies on the same assumption that the target does not understand what is being done to them." The LED screen behind me lit up. The first document was an email chain, Damien Mercer's private address at the top, a shell company account below dates and amounts in clear black font. The second was the dual ledger Lucas Grayson had placed on Catherine's table. The third was the nursing home intake form with the Sunrise Gardens letterhead. The fourth was the laboratory toxicology report, confirming a sedative compound consistent with long-term low-dose administration. The fifth was Vivian Mercer's signed testimony, her name printed clearly beneath her statement. The sixth was Charlotte Bennett's sworn account, 3 pages every paragraph dated and witnessed. Each document appeared with a timestamp and a name. No commentary, no narration. The document spoke in the precise, unforgiving language of evidence, the only language that cannot be argued with in a room full of people who have built careers on knowing the difference between a claim and a proof. The ballroom went completely still, not the comfortable quiet of an attentive audience. The airless total stillness of 1,200 people processing something they had not expected to be real. And then from the table in the third row, the whispering began. I did not turn toward their table. I stood at the edge of the stage while the room processed what they had just read, accepting handshakes from the people who came forward, board members, city officials, 2 federal prosecutors I recognized from the SEC coordination meeting 3 weeks ago. I shook each hand and said the appropriate things, and behind me from the third row, I heard everything. Damien's voice, first low, controlled the voice of a man trying to keep a catastrophic argument at a whisper in a room of 1,200 people. "You knew who he was." Eleanor, sharp and defensive. "I did not know the scale of this. I saw one account statement 11 years ago. I had no idea what Whitaker International. You brought me into this house." Damien's whisper had an edge to it now, something thin and dangerous. "You told me he was a stubborn retiree with no real assets. You said the estate was the primary holding." "I told you what I believed." Eleanor's voice cracked not with guilt, but with fury, the fury of a woman who had just watched 20 years of calculation collapse in 4 minutes. "You were the one with the plan, Damien. You drew up the documents, you found the doctors, you arranged everything." Brandon cut in tight and clipped, "She's right. This was your scheme." "My scheme." Damien let out a short, airless sound that was not quite a laugh. "You signed the email, Brandon, the one about the Bennett Family Trust. That is your signature on a document that describes how you intended to redirect your fiancé's inheritance through your own holding account. A beat of silence, short electric. That email was a draft, Brandon said, but his voice had lost its footing. It was sent, Damien said flatly, to 3 recipients. It's on the screen. Vanessa's voice came next, lower fractured the voice of someone who had been crying and had stopped, not because they felt better, but because they had run out of the energy to continue. I just wanted to stop being his daughter, she said, to no one in particular, to the tablecloth, or to whatever remained of the evening she had walked in so certain about. I just wanted my own name. I didn't want anyone to get hurt. Eleanor turned on her. I could hear the shift in direction, the controlled fury finding a new target. And the nursing home paperwork, Vanessa, you filed that yourself. You had that conversation with the intake coordinator. Do not tell me you didn't understand what you were signing. You told me it was a precaution. I told you it was necessary. There is a difference between those two things, Mother. Nobody answered her. Nobody defended anybody. The 4 of them sat inside the architecture of what they had built together and discovered, as people always discover too late, that there was not a single load-bearing wall left standing. I handed the microphone back to the MC, accepted a final handshake from Preston Hale, who pressed my hand with both of his and said nothing, because nothing was needed, and walked toward the side exit without looking at the 3rd row. I had heard enough. The VIP room off the main corridor was quiet and small, and smelled of fresh coffee that Richard had arranged before I arrived. Catherine was already there, a compact steel safe open on the side table, a manila envelope in her hands. She held it out to me without preamble. The original, she said. Dated August 2019, signed, witnessed, notarized. I took the envelope and opened it. The document inside was 11 pages. I had written it carefully over the course of 3 weeks in the summer of a year, when I had still believed that the people I was leaving, things to understood what those things had cost. 60% of Whitaker International's equity to Brandon, 25% to Vanessa. A lifetime income trust for Eleanor guaranteed indexed to inflation, more than she could spend in 2 lifetimes. Total value at current assessment, $22 billion. I held the pages in both hands and read the first paragraph, the way you read something you wrote when you were a different version of yourself, with the particular grief of recognizing the person you used to be, and understanding with full clarity that he no longer exists. Richard stood near the window, with his hands clasped his face, composed and patient. Catherine sat across from me, with her hands folded on the table, watching me, with the careful attention of someone who understood that this moment required witness, not commentary. I set the document down on the table, flat, centered, final. The new version, I said. Catherine reached into her case and produced a second document, 40 pages prepared, over the preceding 6 weeks, reviewed by 4 attorneys, clean and thorough, and entirely redirected. The Theodore Whitaker Foundation for Elder Financial Protection. Seed capital of $800 million. The remaining equity restructured into a protected trust with an independent board. $22 billion. Gone from the people who had spent 12 years proving they should never have had it. I picked up the pen. They had not lost the empire because I was cruel. They had lost it because they had taken 11 years. 11 years of evidence, of choices of documents signed and schemes drawn up, and phone calls made, and glasses of scotch quietly poisoned to demonstrate beyond any standard of proof that they were not the people I had written those 11 pages for. I signed the new document on the line Catherine indicated, and the pen did not tremble once. Michael Reeves called me at 9:47 on Monday morning. "It's done," he said. He walked in at 9 with his attorney. The 2 SEC investigators from the Chicago regional office were already there. The FBI liaison arrived at 9:15. A pause, the particular pause of a man reviewing notes. He tried to redirect immediately, told them Eleanor had full knowledge of the asset structure and had actively facilitated the scheme, said she was the one who approached him, not the other way around. I was standing at the window of the 43rd floor, looking out at a Chicago that was gray and cold and indifferent. What did his attorney say? His attorney told him, and I'm quoting from our contact in the room, "Damien, stop talking." Michael's voice was dry. He didn't stop. He kept going for another 4 minutes before the lead investigator put the binder on the table. Dual ledger, ghost contracts, wire transfers, Vivian's testimony, Lucas's full cooperation agreement, the toxicology report. All of it tabbed and indexed. Another pause. The investigator said, and again, I'm quoting, "Mr. Mercer, this is not a case where blame shifting will produce a useful outcome for you. The documentation is comprehensive. I'd suggest you listen to your attorney." My chest felt tight, not with satisfaction, but with the particular weight of a thing that has been in motion for a long time, finally arriving at its destination. "And then?" I asked. "And then Damian Mercer sat down." Michael said, and for the first time in the 6 weeks I have been building this file, he had absolutely nothing to say. I thanked Michael and ended the call. 25 years ago, I had terminated Damian Mercer for embezzling $400,000 from Whitaker International's operating accounts. He had sat across from me that day with the same gray eyes, the same controlled mouth, and said nothing as security walked him out. I had believed at the time that the consequences were sufficient, that a man who lost everything at 30 would learn something from it. I had been wrong. People did not change. They simply found larger stages for the same performance. The number then had been $400,000. The number now was $86 million. The crime was the same. Only the scale had grown. Brandon was already in Catherine's office when I arrived on Wednesday. He was sitting in the chair across from her desk, with his elbows on his knees and his hands pressed together in front of his mouth, the posture of a man who had been waiting long enough that the waiting had become its own kind of punishment. He looked up when I entered. His eyes were red-rimmed, not from recent crying, but from the kind of exhaustion that comes after several days of it. Catherine placed the envelope on the table between us, without ceremony. Plain manila, no label. The seal had been broken weeks ago when I had first opened it in my study and sat with what was inside for the better part of an hour. Brandon looked at it. His jaw worked. "Is that—" "Yes," I said. He reached out and pulled the single page from the envelope. I watched his eyes move across the document, the clinical language of a laboratory report, the two names at the top, the conclusion in the final paragraph that left no ambiguity about what it meant. His hands were trembling. Not slightly genuinely trembling the way hands tremble when the body is processing something the mind has not yet fully accepted. He set the paper down and pressed both palms flat on the table, breathing hard through his nose. "How long have you known—" His voice came out cracked and low, barely above a whisper. "Since you were 4 years old," I said. Brandon's head came up. His eyes searched my face with an expression I had never seen on him before. Stripped of the ambition, stripped of the performance, stripped of 41 years of careful positioning. Just a man suddenly who did not know who he was. "And you never—" He stopped. His throat moved. His eyes filled fast, and total tears spilling before he could stop them. And he pressed the back of his hand hard against his mouth, his shoulders shaking a sound coming out of him that was thick and broken and completely without pretense. I waited until the worst of it had passed. "You raised me," he said. Finally his voice wrecked. "You knowing that you raised me. I raised you because I chose to be your father," I said. "Not because of a laboratory result. That was my choice. It had nothing to do with biology." I held his gaze steadily. "And what happened in that house 3 weeks ago? The papers on the table, the nursing home, documents, the phone calls to Damian. That was your choice. You made it with full knowledge of what you were doing." Brandon's chin crumpled. The tears came again harder this time, deep wrenching sobs that shook his whole frame, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere below grief, from the place where a person finally confronts the full cost of who they chose to be. He pressed both hands over his face and bent forward over the table. I watched my son cry for the first time in 41 years, and I did not move toward him. I could not. The man who would have crossed that room, the man who had steadied Brandon's first bicycle, who had sat beside his hospital bed through a childhood fever, who had believed for 37 years that the boy was his. In every way that mattered, that man had stood at the head of a dining room table on a rainy Thursday night and watched Brandon place a financial power of attorney in front of him and say, "Just sign it and we're done." I understood the grief. I could not reach past what had caused it. Eleanor arrived at the university club on a Tuesday afternoon, 2 weeks after the gala, wearing the same composure she had worn to every event there for 11 years, shoulders back, chin level. The practiced ease of a woman who had always known exactly where she belonged in a room. She did not belong in this room anymore. Every person in it already knew that. The first table she approached, 4 women she had lunched with monthly for 6 years, shifted in their chairs as she drew near. Conversation did not stop. It simply redirected the way water redirects around an obstacle, finding a new path, without acknowledging that anything had changed. One woman made brief eye contact and looked away with the specific speed of someone who had decided in advance not to engage. Eleanor adjusted her grip on her purse and moved toward the bar. Preston Hale was standing near the far window with 2 other men. He saw her from across the room. She was certain he saw her because his eyes landed on her face for one clear second before he turned deliberately and without hurry to face the window instead. She stood at the bar and ordered a glass of wine. She did not want her back straight, her expression controlled. Her hands wrapped around the stem of the glass were white at the knuckles. A woman she had known for 15 years, Margaret, who had once called Eleanor her closest friend at the club, who had been photographed beside her at 3 charity galas, appeared at her elbow. Her voice was gentle, the careful gentleness of a woman delivering something unpleasant with the minimum necessary cruelty. "Eleanor," Margaret touched her arm briefly. "I think it might be better if you went home today." Eleanor's eyes snapped to her face. For a moment her composure cracked, her lips pressed together hard, her nostrils flared, and something moved behind her eyes that was equal parts fury and a pain so deep it had no name for it yet. "Margaret, I'm sorry." Margaret's voice was genuinely sorry, which made it worse. "I really am." Eleanor set her wine glass down on the bar. She straightened her jacket. She turned and walked toward the exit with her head up, and her pace measured and her eyes fixed on the door, because the door was the only thing in the room she could look at without seeing what she had become. She had spent 34 years wanting this room, wanting the tables, the membership, the particular warmth of being known and accepted in a place where not everyone was permitted entry. She had genuinely believed that Theodore's flannel shirts and his old truck and his refusal to play the social game were the things standing between her and the life she deserved. She had sold the one person in her life who actually owned this world, and in doing so, she had made herself someone this world would never let back in. The door closed behind her. The room continued without a pause. Charlotte called me on a Thursday evening 3 weeks after the gala, while I was reading in the suite at the Langham that had become quietly and without ceremony my home. "I have something to tell you," she said. Her voice was careful, the careful voice she used when she was not certain how I would receive what came next. "About Vanessa." I set my book down. "Go ahead." "She went back to the attorney's office today, the one on LaSalle Street where she filed the name change petition." Charlotte paused. "She withdrew it." I did not respond immediately. Outside the window, Chicago was dark and the lake was invisible beyond the city lights, but I knew it was there. "Did she say why?" I asked. The attorney asked her the same thing. Charlotte's voice softened slightly. "She said, and this is exactly what the attorney told me, she said Mercer isn't a name worth having anymore, and Whitaker—" Another pause. She didn't finish the sentence. She just let it go. I thought about my daughter sitting in that office on LaSalle Street in the same chair where she had once sat with her chin up and her future arranged neatly in front of her, and I felt something move through my chest that was not quite grief and not quite forgiveness and not quite anything with a clean name. "How did she seem?" I asked. "The attorney said she sat for a long time before she left," Charlotte said quietly. "She didn't cry, she just sat there. A beat. I thought you should know." "Thank you, Charlotte," I said. I held the phone after the call ended and looked at the city for a long time without seeing it. Vanessa had walked into that office wanting a new name, wanting the clean slate of someone who had no obligation to anyone who came before. She had walked out with the same name she was born with and no particular future attached to it, and she had not cried about it. I did not know if that was the beginning of something or simply the absence of something else. The story did not give me that answer. Some things did not resolve cleanly. Some things simply stopped moving and waited. The signing took place on a Monday morning in late November, when the first real cold of the season had settled over Chicago, and the heating in Catherine's building was running loud and steady through the walls. Catherine had the document prepared on the conference table, 42 pages, tabbed each signature line, flagged with a small yellow marker. 2 witnesses sat at the far end of the table, a paralegal named Doris, who had worked in Catherine's office for 19 years, and a notary public named Gerald, who had a precise gray mustache and the unhurried manner of a man who had witnessed 10,000 important moments and treated each one with equal care. I sat down, picked up the pen, and read the first page in full before signing it. I always read what I signed. That had been true for 50 years, and it would be true today. Catherine stood across from me, with her hands folded and her reading glasses pushed up onto her head, watching me with the quiet attention she brought to everything that mattered. 80% to the foundation, she said, confirming aloud as I moved through the pages. The Theodore Whitaker Foundation for Elder Financial Protection. Seed capital of $800 million. Independent board of 7. Primary mandate legal aid and financial recovery services for adults over 60 subject to financial exploitation. I turned a page and signed. 15% to Charlotte Bennett. Catherine nodded once. 15% to Charlotte Bennett, held in a managed trust until the board transfer is complete, with the notation you specified. The notation read, "In recognition of courage, integrity, and the understanding that loyalty to what is right costs more than loyalty to what is convenient." I had written that line myself. I had not shown it to anyone before. Catherine, who had read it, set the document down and said only, "That's right," in a voice that meant she agreed with both the sentiment and the phrasing. I turned to the final allocation page. 5%. One name. Vanessa, I said. 5% to Vanessa Whitaker. Catherine confirmed. Her voice was neutral, but her eyes were not. The notation stands as written. I looked at the line I had added 3 weeks ago, on a quiet evening in the Langham suite after Charlotte had told me about LaSalle Street. The notation read, "Not because she has earned it, because I am still her father." "It stands," I said. I signed the page. Gerald the notary leaned forward and applied his seal with the small mechanical press he carried in a leather case, the sound of it, clean, definitive, permanent, filling the quiet room. Doris signed as witness and dated the line beneath. Catherine gathered the completed document with both hands and aligned the pages carefully against the table. Her eyes were bright, not with tears, but with the particular brightness of a person who has spent 30 years doing difficult work and occasionally gets to witness it mean something. "Is there anything else?" she asked. I picked up the pen once more and turned it over in my fingers. Outside the window, the first snow of the season was beginning, small and quiet, the kind that didn't accumulate, but reminded you it was coming. "Do you want them to know?" Catherine asked. "The terms, the allocations." She met my eyes steadily. "Brandon and Eleanor, do you want them told?" I considered it. I thought about Brandon sitting in this office 3 weeks ago with his hands pressed over his face. I thought about Eleanor walking out of the university club with her chin up and nowhere left to go. I thought about Vanessa on LaSalle Street sitting in a chair long after she needed to, not crying, just sitting. "They'll know," I said. "When it's time." Catherine nodded and closed the folder. The snow outside the window continued small and patient, covering everything it touched, with a quiet and equal white. 6 months after the gala, on a bright March morning, when the last of Chicago's winter was finally loosening its grip, the Theodore Whitaker Foundation opened its doors. The hall held 400 people, and every seat was filled. I stood in the back deliberately by choice and watched the room from the place where no spotlight reached. Gloria Bennett sat in the front row, in a navy dress she had clearly pressed that morning. Her white hair set her hands folded in her lap, with the particular composure of a woman who had spent decades watching from the edges of rooms and understood finally what it meant to be seated at the center. She had not cried when I told her what Charlotte's role would be. She had simply nodded and said, "I raised her right," and I had said, "You did," and neither of us had needed to say anything further. Vivian Mercer took the podium before Charlotte. She stood straight, her silver hair cropped close, her Boston vowels carrying cleanly to the back of the room. "I waited 12 years, she said, "for someone strong enough to stand behind me. 12 years of attorneys who told me the evidence wasn't sufficient, of investigators who said the amounts were too complicated, of people who looked at what had been done to me and decided it wasn't worth the effort." Her voice did not waver, but her hands gripping the sides of the podium were white at the knuckles. What this foundation represents is the answer to those 12 years. It is someone finally deciding that it is worth the effort. She looked out at the room. "I am here because Theodore Whitaker decided that what happened to me and to Sandra Hollis and to Patricia Wren And to every person in this country who has been treated as a target rather than a human being, should not happen again without consequence. The room was completely still. Then the applause came full and genuine, the kind that fills a hall from the floor up. Charlotte took the podium after Vivian stepped back. She was 33 years old, and she stood there with her shoulders square and her notes in her hand, and the particular calm of someone who has earned the right to take up space in a room. She spoke about the Foundation's mandate, its legal aid structure, its partnerships with the SEC's Elder Fraud Division and the Illinois Attorney General's office. She spoke about the case intake process and the financial recovery program. She spoke in the language of someone who understood both the law and the people it was meant to protect. I watched her from the back of the hall and felt something settle in my chest, warm and steady, and without the sharp edges that had been living there for the better part of a year. When it was my turn, I walked to the microphone and looked out at the 400 faces. I built this foundation for one reason, I said. Not for revenge, not for recognition. I paused. Because no one should be treated the way I was treated, and because the people who did it were counting on the assumption that I had no one in my corner. I looked at Gloria in the front row. I looked at Vivian seated now, her hands finely relaxed in her lap. I looked at Charlotte standing to my right, with her notes held at her side. They were wrong. That was all I said. Afterward, standing near the windows while the room moved around me, I looked at Charlotte laughing with Michael Reeves across the hall, Gloria's granddaughter, the woman who had placed her phone on a coffee shop table on a Thursday morning and told me she was scared, but she would tell the truth, Brandon's former fiancé, the person who now held 15% of an empire and the title of executive director of an organization built to do something genuinely useful with it. For the first time in a very long time, I understood what people meant when they said family was not only a matter of blood. Richard came into the office on a Tuesday morning in November one year, almost to the day after the night I had walked out of the house on Elmwood Drive with a small travel bag and 3 items inside it. He set a single sheet of paper on the desk. I read it without picking it up. Damian Mercer had been sentenced 11 days prior in federal court, 11 years federal penitentiary. No parole eligibility for the first 7, 3 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of elder financial exploitation with organizational enhancement, 1 count of money laundering. His attorney had entered a guilty plea after the trial, evidence Lucas Grayson's cooperation, Vivian's testimony, Michael's investigative files. The dual ledger had been presented in pre-trial motions, and the judge had denied every suppression request. Eleanor was living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Evanston. Richard reported this without editorializing. I received it the same way. Brandon had lost his business consulting license 6 months prior, following a state investigation into the Bennett Family Trust irregularities. He was working as an independent contractor. He was living by all accounts quietly. Charlotte had ended the engagement the week after the gala. She had not discussed it with me, and I had not asked. Vanessa still used the name Whitaker. She had not contacted me. She had not cut contact either. There had been no formal communication of any kind, which meant the door was neither open nor closed, but simply present. Richard clasped his hands and looked at me across the desk. "Would you like to reach out to Vanessa?" I turned toward the window. Chicago spread out below, in the November gray, the lake dark at the horizon, the city doing what cities do, continuing regardless without waiting for anyone to be ready. "Let her decide," I said. "When she's ready, she'll know where to find me." Richard nodded once and gathered the paper from the desk. The office was quiet. The city moved below, and I sat in the chair that had always been mine and let the year settle around me like the first snow of a season that was only just beginning. The fog was still sitting low over the yard when I came outside. It was the kind of Saturday morning that asked nothing of anyone. Quiet streets, gray-white sky, the smell of cold grass and coffee mixing together, in the way they only do when the world has not yet decided what kind of day it wants to be. I was wearing the flannel shirt, the dark green one soft at the elbows from years of use, the left pocket slightly stretched from carrying too many things in it over too many years. I had 4 others like it in the closet. I wore this one because it was comfortable and because I had always worn it and because there was at this point in my life no force on earth capable of making me apologize for that. I walked the perimeter of the fence with my coffee the way I always did on Saturday mornings, checking the posts out of habit rather than necessity. The loose board was on the north side third post. From the gate, the same section I had repaired 18 months ago on the morning all of this began. The wind had worked one of the new nails free overnight. It was a small thing, the kind of small thing that gets worse if you ignore it and takes 4 minutes if you don't. I went back to the garage and got the hammer. The phone rang while I was lining up the first nail, Richard's name on the screen. I answered it holding the hammer in my other hand. "Good morning, Chairman, the Hartwell acquisition." The board reviewed the revised offer overnight. 2 billion final terms. They're requesting your approval to proceed. "Approved?" I said. "Send the confirmation to Catherine by noon." "Of course. Anything else?" "No," I said. "That's everything." I put the phone in the flannel pocket and drove the nail home in 2 clean strikes, then the second. I stepped back, tested the board, with both hands firm, flush right. The fog was beginning to lift at the edges of the yard, the morning light finding its way through in long, flat pieces laying itself across the grass without any particular urgency. $34 billion in consolidated assets, 3 ports, 12 logistics centers, a foundation with 400 active cases across 19 states, and a fence that needed fixing, so I fixed it. They had looked at the flannel shirt and seen a man with nothing. They had been so certain of what it meant, the worn collar, the old truck the Saturday morning spent doing the kind of work that people with money paid other people to do. They had built an entire plan around that certainty. They had never once considered that a man might simply like what he likes. I finished the coffee. I set the hammer on the porch railing. I looked out at the yard, the fence straight, the fog clearing, the morning opening itself up, the way mornings do when you're still around to see them. They thought the flannel shirt was evidence of poverty, but I wore it because I liked it, and after everything that had happened, I still did. This has been my story, a family story I never planned to tell. I spent 12 years wearing a flannel shirt in a house full of people who never once asked who I really was. I let it happen, and if I am honest with myself, that is the part I carry heaviest, not what they did. What I allowed in silence for too long. So here's what I want to say to you, directly. Do not do what I did. Do not wait until the people you love have signed the papers and packed your bags before you decide to speak. Family betrayal does not begin with a dramatic moment. It begins with small silences, small compromises, small days where you choose peace over truth. I know this because I lived it. I believe God gives every person a moment of clarity, one clear morning, where you finally see things as they are. Mine came on a rainy Thursday night, standing at a door with a bag I had packed 4 days earlier. I am grateful I did not waste that moment. This is only one family story among millions. Family betrayal is more common than anyone wants to admit, and every family story deserves to be told honestly. If any part of this moved, you leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and stay close to this channel. The next story is already waiting. Thank you truly for staying until the very end. A gentle note. The stories on this channel contain fictional elements crafted purely for reflection and storytelling. If this type of content is not for you, we completely understand. Please feel free to explore whatever speaks to your heart.